Welcome to MacStories Unwind, a weekly review of everything MacStories and more. Today's episode is brought to you by InnoReader. I'm John Voorhees. With me is Federico Viticci. Hi, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
Doing all right. It's Friday, and we've got some really good picks for people. You and I need a little R&R, so we've got some really good picks for people this week. But before we get to that, we need to go through a handful of stories and what's going on the other parts of MacStories and just kind of recap everything for everyone. And the one for me that started this week off on Monday was an overview that I did of the Epic versus Apple antitrust case.
Hey, it's Lawyer John. Lawyer John is here. All court race. Is that what they say? Race. Well, not for lawyers.
Lawyer John was up on a high shelf in the closet. Had been parked there for, well, you could say the last 3 or 4 years, but you could probably say more like the last 5 or 6, including the last couple of years that I was Lawyer John officially. And I decided that, there's a lot of writing going on about this lawsuit that isn't super well informed, and that's, to be expected because tech writers aren't necessarily don't have the legal background, but I do. And while I'm not an expert in antitrust law by any stretch of the imagination, I do understand the process and how that kind of thing works. So I wanted to do this right, and I spent many hours reading through primarily the findings of fact and conclusions of law that were submitted to the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California by both Apple and Epic. Now, each of these documents is about 350 pages long. I didn't read every single word, but I read them pretty closely because what's really what that document serves as is kind of a menu for the judge. It's like, Judge, here's what we're going to prove to you at trial, and here's what the law is that applies, and here's how you should decide the case. So it's kind of like a wish list to the judge. And both sides do that from their own perspective, and it creates a great overview of what's going to happen at trial. Now, of course, what actually happens at trial is that witnesses get on the witness stand, and people get to ask questions, including the judge, and you can kind of decide who's credible, who's not, and the judge makes a decision. Because this is not a jury trial. This is a bench trial, as they call it, where the judge makes the decision. And I think that was agreed to by all the parties just because it speeds the process up. And frankly, this is one of the fastest big trials like this I've ever seen come to the courtroom because, all this stuff went down in August of last year. And here we are, May of the following year, and we've got the trial going. And that's actually pretty fast for something that's this significant in terms of both, the documents involved, the people involved, and all that sort of thing. So, what do you want to know about this lawsuit, Federico? I mean, there are 2 things that I focused on in my story that I could tell you about.
Who's gonna win?
Apple's gonna win, and they're gonna win easily, I think. And that if you want, it's hard to write about this stuff because I think one of the things that people do is they kind of put all of their wishes for ways the App Store were different onto this lawsuit and hope that this is going to solve all the problems with the App Store. But it's absolutely not going to do that because this is really just a dispute between Epic and Apple. And Epic wants some very specific things like the ability to sell virtual currency within their Fortnite game. And a lot of developers don't care about that. Now, Epic is going about trying to get that by complaining about a lot of different things on the App Store, but those aren't necessarily things that are going to be changed if, in fact, Epic wins. And I really don't feel like Epic's going to win because I feel like, first of all, an antitrust suit is kind of won or lost by the way you define the market. And one of the examples I used, and I know it's not a perfect example, but if someone came to us and said, I want you to publish my story on MacStories, and we said no, would we be violating antitrust law? Well, no.
Oh, no. Okay. Good.
No, I think we're good there, Federico. But here's the thing. I was like, if you define the market narrowly enough to where, well, if someone can't publish on MacStories, MacStories monopolizes publication of stories on
We have
MacStories.
a monopoly on MacStories stories.
Right. We have a monopoly on that URL. So haven't we violated antitrust? It's like, no, because obviously you can publish a story in all sorts of different places. Well, to a degree, Epic's doing something very similar, where they're very narrowly casting what is going on here in terms of the market that they're trying to define to be actually apps on the App Store, which, especially with gaming, I think is difficult because Fortnite is a game that you can play on all sorts of different platforms, whether it's PCs or Macs, or it used to be iOS and Android, as well as other places and consoles and that sort of thing. And Epic would argue that those are not substitutes one for the other, but I do think that a lot of Fortnite players do move from one platform to the other, and I think they're going to have trouble showing that their game can't be substituted one platform for the other. And there are a whole other laundry list of other problems too. But the thing besides defining the market that I think is really intriguing about this whole lawsuit is that one way Epic could have gone about this is they could have submitted their app with and been upfront about the fact that they were going to sell V-Bucks inside of their app. That's their digital currency.
Yeah.
And of course, Apple would have said no because that violates the App Store rules. At that point, there's a conflict, and Epic could have gone to court and sued Apple. But they didn't do that. Instead, what they did is they hid it in the app, and then they turned a switch on the server side, and it all happened at once in this big orchestrated PR event where they're trying to make themselves look like the little guy and get a lot of public support and that sort of thing. Which to me, you learned a little bit about the doctrine of unclean hands, which is
yes, the unclean hands from your story. Yes,
it's basically like you cannot manufacture disputes in order to try to win in court. Is one aspect of that. The fact that they were up to no good doing it the way they did, and they shouldn't be able to win just because they were being sneaky. And that's a simplification of how it works, but it's really what it comes down to. And I don't think that necessarily outright bans what Epic's trying to do, because they do have a legitimate gripe with the App Store, at least a viable argument that doesn't get thrown out on its ear in court. But the way they went about it, certainly I don't think helps them. And that's the kind of thing that can influence the decision. Even if Epic were to win, I could see something like the judge giving Epic less relief than they want, less of what they want because of the way they went about this. And it's an interesting backstory. I cover a lot of ground on that in the story. I've been following this day to day. I actually don't have time to set aside 3 weeks listening to courtroom audio, so I'm not doing that. But one person who's in particular good to follow on Twitter, if you want to get kind of the blow-by-blow during the day, is Nick Stat at Protocol, because Nick Stat is listening to all this audio and kind of live tweeting it, it's kind of funny that we've come to a point in the history of the United States where federal court cases are being live tweeted, just like an Apple event, which is kind of funny to me. And total other aside, Federico, before we move on, is that they were having trouble with the audio system in the courtroom when the case.
I've seen this.
It's great. So there is, the judges, the people helping the judge in the courtroom get the conference call set up, because this is really just done. It was done by, I think, an AT&T conference call line. And, you can mute all the people on one of these lines. And these lines, when I joined, my line had like 40 or 50 people on it. And they had multiple lines. And at some point, somebody in the courtroom unmuted the line, and there were a bunch of gamers on the line shouting "Free Fortnite."
And other things, obviously.
And other things. And this, I think the judge was in the courtroom. All the lawyers and witnesses were there.
Amazing.
Yeah, that's not the usual decorum in a courtroom in the federal courts. Now, it's a very limited number of people in there. I think that each team of lawyers can only have like 6 people, and the witnesses are wearing masks. And there's I think 2 pool reporters that are allowed in. Like the New York Times was in one day, and they've been rotating in. So kind of interesting doing this during a pandemic, but I don't know. We'll see. We got a few weeks to go before we see what happens.
Before we move on, John, I have a very important question for you.
What's that?
Have you ever lost a trial?
I have never actually outright tried a case on my own, because usually what I was involved in was corporate bankruptcy, and bankruptcies are like a whole ball of different disputes where I would be trying to basically collect money for big banks from deadbeat corporations. And
fun times.
Yeah, it was good. It was good. And, there would be lawsuits as part of that, but it was more like a giant negotiation between all the people owed money who are all going to some degree, lose because they weren't going to get paid in full. And it was a matter of maneuvering to try to see if you could get more than you were entitled to, basically.
You were the guy that they called when,
The cleaner is what they call it. It's like the cleaner in
closer.
The closer, yeah.
All right. Moving on MacStories this week, you covered the latest update to Carrot Weather.
Yes.
So Carrot Weather was already, I would say, the most powerful weather app on iPhone and iPad. Version 5.2 goes deeper on the customization that is now possible in Carrot Weather 5. There's a new layout page where you can pick and choose all the different layouts. But more importantly, I think, when you're designing a custom section, when you're rearranging the data points or adding separators, for example, you can now preview that section in settings. Used to be in version 5 that you have to make changes in settings, save, go back to the main screen of the app, see if those changes were actually of your liking, and if they weren't, you had to open settings again and make changes and go back. And it was very clunky and slow. And now you can preview those sections in settings, which is so much better than before. And there's also some new types of sections and data points, including, I believe, something that I know Americans are really into. It's not really a European thing. Weather radars, I think is what you call them.
Yeah,
Why?
radars. Like, filing a radar, but for the weather. Yeah, I don't know why people are into that, but
is it because
maybe
in America there's tornadoes and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's part of it. And the weather tends to move from the west to the east, and you can kind of see these big storms coming your way, and that gives you an idea of when it's coming, I suppose. But yeah, that was added. There's also an alerts section, which already there was like an alerts icon that would appear in the current conditions if there was some sort of alert in your area. But now there's a little section that will have more details that you can add as well. And there's new data too. There's tidal data as well. If maybe you're a surfer and you need to know when the tide's going to come in. And I don't know. I mean, not something that I'm going to use, but it's there if you want it. All right, Federico. Also this week, Deezer announced that they are coming to the HomePod as a default music service. You may recall that this was launched earlier, I guess late last year, after iOS 14 came out, that you can have a different default music service for your HomePods other than Apple Music. And Pandora was the first to do this late last year, but now Deezer's on board as well. Works very much the same kind of way as Pandora. I mean, these music services only have so many features in terms of what you can request by your voice to them, but Deezer is notable because it has lossless music as one of its tiers of service, and that's available on the HomePod too. Now, I'm not so sure you really care so much about having lossless music on your HomePod minis, because as much as I like my minis, they're really not designed for high I guess lossless music. They're just not that, they don't sound that great, right? But if you have one of the original HomePods, I think that might make a difference. I have not tried Deezer yet though, so I haven't tried it side by side with Apple Music. Federico, why don't you tell us about Club MacStories, because we had a good issue this week.
Good issue of MacStories Weekly out today. We interviewed Jason Snell of Six Colors, friend of the show, friend of ours, really.
Friend of ours in general, yes, all around.
Yes, we interviewed Jason about his writing setup, all the different apps that he uses across the Mac and iPad. Jason is one of the very few Mac people, I count you in this group, John, who always kept an open mind regarding the iPad as not just a companion or like a couch tablet for watching Netflix, but as an alternative computer that can be used alongside the Mac. So you are in good company with Jason, John.
I think so too.
At least in my mind. So we interviewed Jason about the apps that he uses, BB Edit on the Mac, something else on iPad. And especially we wanted to ask him about his automations, all these different scripts that he uses on the Mac. Fascinating interview. Go check it out in Weekly. Speaking of text, you had a collection of plain text utilities that are not regular text editors. So what other things can you do with plain text that is not just, putting together a blog post or, a short document? Fascinating collection of different apps. We are giving away 10 copies of Scorecard, which is the latest app by Lickability, which is a fun and very versatile scorekeeping utility for iPhone and iPad. And lastly, I had an extension story about my adventure in trying to import data from Toggl into Timemator, which is this new, relatively recent time tracking utility for Apple platforms. It was not fun, I can tell you that much.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like it was a great experience. Yeah, Timemator is an interesting app. It was on the Mac first, but now it's on iPad as well. All right, Federico, on App Stories this week, we talked about a whole bunch of stuff, but we talked about Substack, and a lot of this was email-based. We talked about Substack. We talked about moving our email provider from Hey to back to Gmail for now. And we talked about data portability in general, which is kind of where my story about plain text apps that aren't text editors came from for Weekly, because I was thinking about that all week. But it's good discussion. I mean, I think a lot of the stuff you're doing with Obsidian kind of syncs up with this issue of data portability. So we covered that there. Okay, Federico, this episode of Unwind and all of MacStories this week is brought to you by InnoReader. It's the premier service for RSS power users. Not only does InnoReader let you fine-tune your RSS experience, but its capabilities really extend far beyond RSS, because you can do things like monitor email newsletters, Twitter feeds, Facebook pages, and web pages that don't even have RSS feeds. Stop visiting long lists of bookmarks every single day and let InnoReader deliver the internet right to your doorstep using its recently redesigned mobile apps, its web app, and third-party apps that integrate with its service too. At its core, InnoReader is an incredibly customizable RSS service that makes it easy to import feeds, whether using OPML or picking brand new feeds. Because InnoReader, if you go to the web app, it has fantastic search functionality, and it also can do things like it can give you suggestions for new feeds you ought to follow based on the ones that you're already following. It also detects things like dead sites that are no longer publishing, and things like that make it easy to maintain and manage your RSS feeds. But RSS is really only part of the story, because as I said, you get a unique email address with a subscription to InnoReader that lets you subscribe to email newsletters. And that way you can enjoy them just like you do anything else in your RSS feed without cluttering up your inbox. It can monitor complex Twitter searches. That's something that I do to kind of keep tabs on what people are mentioning about MacStories on Twitter. And you can monitor things like changes on a web page if it doesn't have an RSS feed already included with that publication. Most recently, InnoReader added an audio player too, so you can even listen to podcasts and other audio that's delivered by RSS right inside the service itself. It's free to try, so you've really got nothing to lose by signing up right now. And until June 4th, Unwind listeners and MacStories readers can upgrade to a pro plan for 20% off for the first year using the code MACSTRY1. I'll put this in the show notes so you can get that, but it's MACSTRY, the number 1 at checkout. That's for 20% off your first year. Go to InnoReader.com today and take back control of your news feed. Our thanks to InnoReader for their support of Unwind. All right, Federico, we've got some Unwind picks, and I know you've got a good one, because this is a topic that's near and dear to both of our hearts.
Yes, this is one that I've been waiting for. It's the latest book by Jason Schreier, Press Reset, Ruin and Recovery in the Video Game Industry. So this book is coming out next week. I believe it's launching on May 11th. Jason was kind enough to send us advanced copies of the book, and I've been reading the book on my Kindle. So I'm gonna cut right to the chase. It's an excellent book. It's, I will say, my favorite thing that Jason has ever written. So I've been following Jason's work for years. Used to work at Kotaku. Now he's a reporter at Bloomberg. Had a first book out a couple of years ago called Blood, Sweat, and Pixels. also about the video game industry. But Press Reset is just a fascinating look at how the video game industry operates.
Right.
Jason has been investigating the video game industry for many years now. He's always the first, he is the person to go to when it comes to getting the details, getting the real story about what happens internally within big video game companies, within video game studios, what the relationships are between management and developers, and in Press Reset, it's such a fascinating tale because so Jason is looking at each chapter tells a different story, looks at a different game. There's it's really nicely put together in the sense that some people can sort of cross over with the paths of other people, but at a high level, this book tells the story of different video game studios and people who work in the video game industry through company shutdowns, through studios that have closed, that have filed for bankruptcy, and tells the story of people who decided to move on and leave the video game industry, but also folks who kept trying until they found success as indie developers, for example. And reading this book, I will say I'm a little over halfway through the book. It really opened my eyes in terms of just how unstable the video game industry seems to be, and the wild working conditions and requirements, right? That these upper management levels or that these executives request that these developers and designers follow. There's a couple of really wild passages from the book, but one thing that really stands out to me is often just a disconnect between these big executives, these people in suites coming in and saying, well, now we're closing your studio. And now there's like 60 or 200 people who, 30 minutes before they were in front of their computers developing a game, animating a character. And after an all hands meeting, they are out of a job. And they told you, you're going to have a severance package, but pack up your things and go. And sometimes they don't even get to pack up their things. There's a couple of moments where Jason explains how those developers were just asked to leave without even being able to grab things from their desks. They were being escorted out of the building by security. So Press Reset, it doesn't tell a fun story, but it's a fascinating look at how, the inner workings of the video game industry. There's, just a few examples. They look at the making of Epic Mickey, which is this Mickey Mouse video game made by a team led by Warren Spector, right? The famous video game designer and developer. Jason looks at this story of BioShock Infinite, one of my favorite games from the Xbox 360 era, and the long and difficult journey from getting BioShock Infinite from a concept to a finished and working video game. He looks at the success of Gwen Frey, a video game designer that, through the ups and downs of leaving a company and founding their own indie studio, eventually found success as, a standalone indie developer. So Press Reset, it's one of those books that I would say they call it, I think, a page turner, right? In the sense that you just want to keep reading. I was reading up until 5:30 a.m. last night, I think.
Oh, wow.
It's really good. It really keeps you wanting more, which is sort of the feeling that I got from Blood, Sweat, and Pixels as well a couple of years ago. But this one, even though it's pretty tragic, the things that happen to some people in the video game industry and the working conditions they had to put up with in terms of crunching, the famous crunch that you got to do at the end of at the process of finishing a video game because the publisher decided that this game is coming out on this date no matter what, because shareholders want that game to be out, by the second quarter of the year, for example. It's a pretty tragic story, but it's also the kind of story that you never see when you purchase a video game, right? When you go to GameStop or when you download the game from the PlayStation Store, you just see the fun of it. You see the trailers and the screenshots and the reviews, but how does it actually work behind the scenes? And this book tells you what actually happens behind the scenes. And
yeah, I was going to say it's a real eye opener. And as we talked about at the beginning, I spent many years as a lawyer, and that was in bankruptcy, and I saw a lot of these kinds of situations where companies would implode. I didn't really ever have any direct involvement in the video game industry, but these kind of things happen, and it's very messy behind the scenes. And the thing about the video game industry is it's so hits driven that they need to really bulk up with a lot of people to get these big games out. But then if things go wrong or the game's over, a lot of those people end up being treated as disposable, which is wrong. And I think that, I think one thing that's nice about Jason's work is he's really shown a light on some of the practices in the video game industry that are wrong and need to change. And, I think there's some change that has happened in the industry, but it's still a very difficult place to work and a very unique place to work as well.
Yep.
And this book really captures it well. And I think, especially since it's such a behind the scenes, nitty gritty, this is how the business of making video games work. It's particularly impressive, I think, how it is a page turner, because that kind of thing can also be very dry and bland in some respects, because there are people looking at spreadsheets and making decisions about which developers have to go, but he captures it through the eyes of the people and the personalities.
It's the human
involved.
Story.
Exactly.
It's the human story behind it.
Exactly.
Something that I also realized in reading the book is how, now I don't know exactly what the situation is in the United States, but I can tell you that in reading some of the stories of these company shutdowns and hostile takeovers and just, abusive bosses that have these wild demands, I have a feeling that kind of situation wouldn't be possible in Italy, where I live.
It's less possible in the EU.
Because of unions, right? Because workers unionize.
Yes,
and it's totally common over here.
Yes, both unions, and there are more worker protection laws in a lot of European countries.
Yeah. And so one last thing I will say, if you like what you just heard, go check out Press Reset, but also go follow Jason's work at Bloomberg, obviously, but also a podcast that I am personally a fan of. It's the Triple Click podcast.
Yeah, very good show.
Jason Schreier, Kirk Hamilton, and Mary Myers. Very good show. I guess at this point, I listen to 2 video game shows. One is Triple Click and the other is The Besties. So Triple Click, very good show.
Yeah, those are both great recommendations. All right, Federico, for my pick this week, I've got a fun little indie game called Pikuniku, which is a funny little platformer
Is it about
puzzle
picnics?
game. No, it's about this little character. You play as this little character that's a little red oval with long bendy legs. It's the artwork is very hand drawn, and you just explore through this landscape of weird creatures and obstacles, trying to accomplish various quests that are given to you by the other characters in the game. There are a lot of games like this in a way, but what makes this one so much fun is kind of the artwork that makes it look like it was drawn by a kid, and the really kind of fun soundtrack. And it's a game that I actually played on Stadia because I was testing that out. That's the video game streaming service from Google, and I wouldn't recommend playing it there. I would recommend picking it up on the Switch or playing on a PC or something through Steam. But fantastic game. It's just a little fun diversion type game, but I picked up last weekend, and it's a lot of fun. All right, Federico, that's it for this week for MacStories Unwind. I want to thank our sponsor again, and that was InnoReader. You can find me and Federico over at MacStories.net. Federico is at Fatici on Twitter and Instagram. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHN VOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.